Stay away from that house. Nobody knows what secrets are kept there.
I found the truth. Those 7 children are safe, and the real mystery lies in the house across the street. The neighbors told us the father next door was dangerous. Then I found 7 children hiding in his basement, and a photograph proving the real danger had been living across the street from us all along. My name is Claire Bennett, and 3 years ago, my husband and I moved into what looked like the safest neighborhood in Ohio. Maple Ridge had clean sidewalks, trimmed lawns, and old trees that formed green arches over the streets. People waved from their porches. Children rode bicycles until the streetlights came on. It was the kind of place where everyone seemed to know everyone else. But before our moving truck was empty, 3 different neighbors gave us the same warning. Stay away from the gray house at the end of Willow Lane. That was where Daniel Mercer lived, with 7 children. No wife, no relatives, no visitors. Just one quiet father and 7 kids who rarely spoke to anyone. Our next-door neighbor, Linda Shaw, was the first to warn me. She brought over a lemon pie, smiled warmly, and then lowered her voice. Daniel has a past, she said. Nobody knows exactly what happened, but his wife disappeared. Soon after that, he arrived here with all those children. If I were you, I would keep my distance. The next morning, a retired police officer named Frank Delaney stopped my husband near the mailbox. Mercer is trouble, he said. Men don't hide 7 children from the world unless they have something to hide. Even the neighborhood association president, Walter Pierce, came to our door. He wore an expensive suit and spoke as if he owned every house on the street. We protect our community, Walter told us. Daniel refuses inspections, ignores complaints, and frightens decent families. Don't let sympathy cloud your judgment. At first, I believed them. Then I met the children. It happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. I was driving home when I saw a little girl standing beside the road. She looked about 8 years old. Her red coat was soaked, and she was holding a paper bag against her chest. I pulled over and rolled down my window. "Are you all right?" I asked. She stared at me without answering. Then the bottom of her wet bag split open. Cans of soup rolled across the pavement. I got out and helped her gather them. She whispered that her name was Sophie. "Do you live in the gray house?" I asked. Fear flashed across her face. "Please don't tell Mr. Pierce I talked to you." Before I could ask why, a tall man came running through the rain. Daniel Mercer stopped several feet away, breathing hard. His clothes were old but clean, and his eyes were filled with worry. "Sophie, I told you to wait inside the store." He turned to me. "Thank you for helping her." His voice was calm. Nothing about him seemed dangerous. Then a black SUV slowed beside us. Walter Pierce sat behind the wheel. He watched Daniel, watched Sophie, and then looked directly at me. He did not wave. He simply drove away. Daniel's expression changed. "You should go home," he said quietly. "Why is Sophie afraid of Walter?" Daniel picked up the groceries. "Because children understand danger before adults are willing to admit it." Then he walked away. That sentence stayed with me all night. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing things that did not match the neighborhood stories. Daniel left home every morning at 5 to work at a repair shop. He returned in the afternoon carrying groceries. He fixed bicycles on his driveway while the children did homework nearby. On Sundays, he cooked outside, and I could hear the children laughing. A dangerous man can pretend to be kind, I told myself, but rumors can pretend to be truth. One evening, someone threw a brick through Daniel's front window. A note was tied around it. "Li before somahatni warsi happens." My husband, Mark, and I ran outside when we heard the glass break. Daniel stood in the living room, shielding the youngest child with his body. Frank Delaney appeared almost immediately. He looked at the brick and shrugged. "Probably teenagers," he said. "Shouldn't you call the police?" I asked. Frank's eyes hardened. "I was a police officer for 30 years. I know what deserves police attention." Daniel said nothing, but his oldest daughter, Hannah, was staring at Frank with pure hatred. That was when I noticed a small security camera above Daniel's porch. Later that night, I knocked on his door. "Your camera may have recorded whoever did this," I said. Daniel glanced up at it. The memory card disappeared. "When?" "Before the brick came through the window." I felt cold despite the warm night. Someone had planned the attack. Daniel looked exhausted. "Mrs. Bennett, your neighbors will forgive you for being curious. They will not forgive you for helping me." "Why?" He opened his mouth, but Hannah stepped between us. "Because the last woman who helped us vanished," she said. Daniel ordered her upstairs. I asked him what she meant, but he closed the door. 2 days later, Walter announced an emergency neighborhood meeting. He claimed Daniel's house was unsafe and that the children might be in danger. He presented photographs of broken stairs, exposed wires, and a filthy kitchen. The pictures were shocking. But something bothered me. Daniel's kitchen window had blue curtains. The photograph showed yellow curtains. The floor in his house was dark wood. The photograph showed white tile. Those pictures had been taken somewhere else. When I pointed this out, Walter smiled. "Claire is new," he told the room. "She doesn't understand what we've endured." People laughed nervously. Then Frank stood up and said Daniel had once been questioned in connection with his wife's disappearance. The room went silent. Daniel, who had been standing near the back, walked forward. "I was questioned," he said. "I was also cleared." Walter shook his head. "Cleared is not the same as innocent." Daniel's 7 children stood together behind him. Sophie held her brother's hand. None of them cried. They looked like children who had learned that crying did not make adults listen. The association voted to request a county inspection of Daniel's home. That night, Hannah slipped an envelope under my door. Inside was a photograph of 2 younger men standing outside a construction company. One was Daniel. The other was Walter Pierce. On the back, someone had written Ask Abo Revarsto. I searched online. Riverstone Homes had been a successful building company 15 years earlier. It belonged to Daniel, Walter, and a third partner named Rebecca Lane, Daniel's wife. Then a housing project collapsed during construction. 1 worker died. Several families lost their savings. Company funds disappeared, and Walter testified that Daniel had approved the unsafe materials. Daniel was charged with fraud, but the case fell apart when key records vanished. Rebecca disappeared before she could testify. Walter later bought several properties at very low prices, including most of the land around Maple Ridge. Suddenly, the neighborhood's warnings looked different. They were not protecting us from Daniel. They were protecting Walter from him. I called the reporter who had written the original Riverstone articles. Her name was Evelyn Grant. She agreed to meet me at a diner outside town. Evelyn arrived carrying an old folder. "Daniel wasn't the criminal," she said. "He was the witness." She explained that Daniel had discovered Walter was buying cheap, unsafe materials and stealing the difference. Rebecca had copied the financial records. Before they could contact federal investigators, the construction site collapsed. Walter blamed Daniel. Frank Delaney, who was a police detective at the time, handled the investigation. "Frank made evidence disappear," Evelyn said. "Rebecca knew it. Then she disappeared too?" "Was she murdered?" I asked. Evelyn looked toward the window. "I don't know. But Daniel spent 6 years in prison on a separate fraud charge built from Frank's evidence." I could barely speak. "And the 7 children. Only Hannah and Sophie are Daniel's biological daughters. The other 5 lost parents or guardians because of Riverstone. Daniel took responsibility for them after he was released." The truth made me gasp. The man described as a threat had built a family from the children Walter's crimes had left behind. Before Evelyn left, she gave me a key. "Rebecca mailed this to me shortly before she vanished. I never discovered what it opened. Last month, Walter offered me $50,000 for it." The key had a number stamped on it, 417. When I returned home, my front door was open. Nothing valuable was missing. But every drawer had been searched, and my computer was gone. On my kitchen table was a note. "Any debriu indie bar sul dino di upiol di curves." Mark wanted us to stop. I could not blame him. We had no children, no powerful friends, and no protection from people who had controlled the town for years. But I kept thinking about Sophie in the rain and Hannah's angry eyes. The next morning, I told Daniel everything. When I showed him the key, his face went pale. "Rebecca had a safe deposit box," he said. "Number 417. The bank had closed years ago, but its boxes had been transferred to a private storage company. Evelyn, as the person named on Rebecca's sealed instructions, was able to request access. Inside box 417, we found a flash drive, a ledger, and a video recording. Rebecca appeared on the screen. She looked frightened but determined. She said Walter had stolen more than $4 million, used unsafe concrete, and bribed Frank to destroy evidence. The ledger recorded every payment. The flash drive contained contracts, photographs, and copies of bank transfers. Then Rebecca revealed one final secret. She was alive. Frank had warned her that Walter planned to kill her. Frank had helped her escape, but only after demanding the original evidence. Rebecca gave him false files and entered witness protection through a federal contact she trusted. Frank was corrupt, but he had also betrayed Walter. That explained why both men were afraid. The final file was dated only 6 months earlier. Rebecca promised she would return when Daniel and the children were safe. We finally had proof. But Walter moved first. The county inspector arrived the next day with Frank and 2 sheriff's deputies. They claimed an anonymous caller had reported imprisoned children in Daniel's basement. When the basement door opened, 7 children were sitting at a long table surrounded by school books, art supplies, and emergency food. It was not a prison. It was a classroom and storm shelter. But one deputy found a locked metal case behind a cabinet. Inside were bags of illegal drugs and a handgun with its serial number removed. Daniel stared at them in disbelief. "That is not mine." Frank smiled for less than a second. "I saw it. So did Hannah. The deputies arrested Daniel, and child services took the children away. Walter stood on the sidewalk while the neighborhood watched. "We tried to warn everyone," he announced. He thought he had won. He did not know Daniel had installed a second camera after the brick attack. It was hidden inside an old birdhouse across the street. The recording showed Frank entering Daniel's home through a basement window the night before the inspection. He carried the same metal case. "Instead of giving the recording to local police, I sent copies to the state attorney general, the FBI, Evelyn's newspaper, and every local television station. Then we planned Walter's final surprise. The neighborhood association held a public meeting to vote on forcing the sale of Daniel's property." Walter stood beneath bright lights in the community hall, smiling for cameras. He described himself as a protector of children. I walked to the microphone. "You warned us about Daniel Mercer," I said. "Tonight, I think the neighborhood deserves to know what you were really afraid of." The screen behind Walter turned on. First came the video of Frank planting the case. Then came Rebecca's testimony. Then the bank records appeared, showing payments from Walter to Frank. Walter rushed toward the projector, but 2 federal agents entered through the side doors. Frank tried to leave through the back. He did not get far. And then the main doors opened. A silver-haired woman stepped into the hall. Hannah cried out before anyone else recognized her. "Mom." Rebecca Mercer had come home. Daniel was released that same night. When he entered the hall, all 7 children ran to him. He dropped to his knees and wrapped his arms around them. Even the reporters stopped asking questions. Some moments are too human to interrupt. Walter was charged with fraud, bribery, evidence tampering, conspiracy, and several offenses connected to the Riverstone collapse. Frank accepted a plea deal and testified against him. The court seized Walter's properties and used the proceeds to compensate the surviving families. But Daniel wanted something more than money. At sentencing, Walter turned toward him and said, "You think this makes you a hero?" Daniel answered calmly, "No. Raising these children made me a father. Exposing you simply made me free." Walter received 28 years in federal prison. That was justice. The revenge came later. Daniel used his settlement to buy Walter's mansion after the government auctioned it. He did not move into it. Instead, he transformed it into the Riverstone Family Center, a safe home for children who had lost parents to crime, addiction, or financial disaster. Walter's private office became a counseling room. His wine cellar became a food pantry. The iron gate that once kept people out was removed completely. Rebecca slowly rebuilt her relationship with Daniel and their daughters. The years apart could not be erased, and neither of them pretended otherwise. But they chose honesty over bitterness and healing over silence. As for the neighborhood, people apologized. Some apologies were sincere. Others came from people embarrassed that they had believed the most powerful voice in the room. Daniel accepted none of their excuses, but he did accept their help at the family center. Today, Sophie is 14. She speaks at schools about courage and rumors. Hannah plans to study law. The 5 other children still call Daniel Dad, because family is not always created by blood. Sometimes it is created by the person who refuses to abandon you when the world already has. I often think about the day I arrived at Maple Ridge. Everyone warned me about the quiet father raising 7 children alone. They told me his silence proved he was guilty. The truth was that Daniel had spares protecting children, while guilty men protected their reputations. And that experience taught me something I will never forget. When an entire neighborhood tells you whom to fear, do not listen only to the loudest adults. Look at the children. They usually know where the real danger lies.